What if I told you that the most dangerous weapon the pharaoh ever owned wasn't a bronze sword? It wasn't a war chariot. It wasn't an army of 10,000 spears. It was a board game, carved from ivory, small enough to hold in one hand, beautiful enough to be buried with a king for all eternity. And here's the part the history books skip over. Pause for a second and really sit with this. The Egyptian elite were not playing this game for fun. They were rehearsing for war. Every move of that little ivory lion was a calculated strike. Every square on that board, a piece of foreign territory waiting to be taken. So the question that has haunted archaeologists for over a century is this: was it a sacred ritual to guide the dead through the afterlife? Or was it a secret war room, where the kings of Egypt practiced bloodshed before they ever spilled it? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at an ancient toy the same way again. To understand the secret, you first have to understand the game. Its name was Senet. In the old tongue, it meant the game of passing. And it is old. I mean almost unthinkably old. Senet was already being played more than 5,000 years ago, before the Great Pyramid was even a dream in an architect's mind, while empires rose and crumbled into dust, while languages were born and forgotten. This one game survived. Think about that. 3,000 years of continuous play. There is almost nothing else in human history with that kind of grip on a civilization. Now look at the board itself. 30 squares, 3 rows, 10 columns, clean, geometric, almost militarily precise. You moved your pieces, usually 5 to 7 per player, by casting throwing sticks or knuckle bones into the air. No dice. The way they landed decided how far you could advance. In other words, chance, fate, the role of the gods. And here is your first clue, so notice this carefully. Senet was a game of both skill and chance. Strategy you could control, colliding with luck you could not. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that is exactly what every general who ever lived has had to master. You plan, you position, you calculate every move, and then the chaos of the real world throws the sticks, and you adapt or you die. A pharaoh who could not handle that on a board was a pharaoh you did not want commanding your army. But before we crown Senet as a war machine, let's be honest about the story the experts actually tell, because the official answer is not war. The official answer is death. In one of the most beautiful tombs ever discovered, the tomb of Queen Nefertari, there she sits, painted on the wall, playing Senet. But look closely, she has no opponent across the board. Who is she playing against? The answer chills you a little. She is playing against death itself. By the New Kingdom, Senet had transformed into something sacred. The Egyptians believed the board was a map of the Duat, the terrifying underworld the soul had to cross after death. Each square was a stage of the journey. Some squares meant safety, some meant disaster. The final squares meant rebirth into eternity. To win at Senet was to win your soul's passage into the afterlife. That is why kings were buried with it. Tutankhamun, the boy king, was entombed with not one, but multiple Senet sets, carved boxes, ivory pieces, ready to play in eternity. So the mainstream story is settled, right? It's a religious game, a ritual, a spiritual GPS for the dead. But hold on, ask yourself one simple question. The question almost nobody asks. Why would a people obsessed with conquest, with empire, with crushing their enemies under the wheels of their chariots, build their map of the afterlife as a strategy game you had to outmaneuver to survive? That's not a coincidence. That's a worldview. Here is something you need to understand about the pharaohs, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. To them, everything was war. Their temples weren't decorated with peaceful gardens. They were covered, wall to wall, floor to ceiling, with images of conquest. Pharaohs smashing skulls, armies marching into the Levant, foreign kings on their knees. The Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, was the great prize. A land of fortified cities, walled, defended, the kind of cities you could not simply charge at. You had to think your way in. A siege is not a battle. A siege is a puzzle. You cut off the water. You starve the supply lines. You wait, you position, you sacrifice a small force here to open a gap there. You manage time, resources, and morale across a board you cannot fully control. Now go back to Senet. You advance your pieces square by square. You block your opponent's path. You send a piece backward as a sacrifice to protect a more valuable one. You manage risk against the roll of fate. Are you starting to see it? The logic of Senet. Advance, block, sacrifice, control the path, manage chance is the exact same logic as a military campaign. And this is where it gets personal, so lean in. The elite of Egypt, the princes, the generals, the future commanders of armies, these were the people playing Senet from childhood, obsessively, for their entire lives. What do you think happens to a young mind that spends thousands of hours learning to think several moves ahead, learning to read an opponent, learning to stay calm when the sticks fall against you? It gets trained, not in a classroom, not with a sword, but across a checkered grid disguised as play. And Senet wasn't the only game on the table. There was a game we now call Hounds and Jackals, a racing game where each player's pieces were topped with the carved heads of hunting animals, hounds against jackals, predator against predator. There was Mihan, a board coiled like a giant serpent, named after a snake god who literally protected the sun god from his enemies in battle each night. And there was the game of 20 squares, a strategy game Egypt borrowed from Mesopotamia, the same region they were forever fighting over. Even their games traveled the war roads. Now, about those ivory lions. Across the ancient world, lions were not cute. The lion was the ultimate symbol of royal violence. Pharaohs were depicted as lions devouring their enemies. Lion imagery meant one thing: the king as an unstoppable killing force. So when an Egyptian noble picked up a lion-headed gaming piece and pushed it forward to capture territory on a board, he wasn't just moving a toy. He was rehearsing the role of the conqueror. He was being the lion, practicing in miniature the predator he was expected to become. The toy and the lesson were the same object. Now, I owe you the truth, because anyone who tells you they have proof that Senet was a literal military academy is selling you something. We have not found a single ancient text that says, use this board to plan the siege of a Levantine city. No general's manual, no royal decree. That tablet, if it ever existed, is still buried or gone forever. So let's be precise about what we actually know versus what we infer. What we know, the Egyptians were a war civilization. Their elite played strategy games obsessively. Those games rewarded the exact mental skills a commander needs: foresight, patience, sacrifice, calm under chance. And their symbolism was soaked in conquest and royal power. What we infer, that this was not an accident, that a culture which turned even its vision of the afterlife into a strategic contest almost certainly trained its strategic mind at the gaming board, whether they wrote it down or not. Here's the way I'd put it. You don't need a textbook that says chess builds strategic thinking to know that it does. The skill transfers whether or not anyone names it. The pharaohs may never have called Senet a war game, but every time they played it, they were sharpening the very weapon they used to conquer the ancient world, the weapon between their ears. So picture it one last time: a pharaoh alone in lamplight 3,000 years ago. He casts the ivory sticks. He moves his lion one square forward. He blocks, he waits. He sacrifices a piece to win the board. To the priests, he's preparing his soul for the afterlife. To the servants, he's just passing the evening. But maybe, just maybe, he's doing something else entirely. Maybe he's looking through that little grid of 30 squares and seeing the walled cities of the Levant, seeing the supply lines, seeing the empire he's about to take. The most dangerous weapon in the pharaoh's arsenal was never the bronze in his hand. It was the strategy in his mind, and it was forged, one move at a time, on a sacred board game carved from ivory. The next time someone tells you it's just a game, remember the pharaohs, and remember what they built, one square at a time. If this changed the way you see the ancient world, hit that subscribe button. Because next we're decoding the secret meaning hidden inside the pyramids themselves. You won't believe what the geometry reveals. I'll see you in the next one.